Okay, so I hope you can all hear me. Well, you don't hear anything. All right. All right. Are you doing
Yeah,
introductions?
yeah. I was a super happy to know from Linux Foundation Europe project
It is a big topic.
that could try to avoid the US. I was shocked at first. What a arms some kind of they were talking about because I think it's a subject.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sure what you're going to hear is like really slightly on a different note than the talks about financial transactions. It was actually super interesting for me, but this is very different. Yesterday, I was at the European Resilience Summit, which was literally like right over there, next building. And yeah, it was a gathering of a very diverse set of parties. And the most striking thing to me was that I was the only open source person there. And that's not supposed to be a bad thing. It is when you're coming from an open source background like I do, you think that open source is at the heart of digital sovereignty. But that's not a perspective of people that don't know technology that well or open source. I took a lot of insights from that yesterday in that we need to explain more what this relationship is. And surprisingly, that is, of course, what we're doing at the Linux Foundation Europe. So we're the European chapter of the Linux Foundation. And we not only support projects like FINOS when they do activities in Europe, or we bring European participants into the projects, we also go to Brussels, to Berlin, to Paris, to Den Haag, to speak to policymakers, etc., about what open source technologies can bring to their efforts, especially when it's about digital sovereignty. One thing to highlight to them is why it matters. What you see on screen, many people still think of open source primarily as a set of like free building blocks of technology, which it is, but that doesn't really describe the impact it has on society. The impact is massive. As you can see here, we calculated a full payroll for everybody who contributes to our projects, and we would have to pay 27 billion US dollars per year, 26, sorry, to pay for all those contributions that you are making, which is of course impossible. So the only way we can build technology that is scale is through open source collaboration globally. The Harvard study here that you've probably heard quoted a couple of times estimates the supply side value at 4 billion, which is the software that we've written, and the demand side value, meaning what industry would have to invest to replace all those open source components that exist, at 8.8 trillion US dollars. I participated in a European Commission study on the impact of open source in Europe, and the impact that it's just using and contributing to open source makes to the European Union GDP was estimated between 65 and 95 billion euros per year. So pretty big. These numbers actually impress people when they're policymakers because they realize that it matters to them. Now, we often come to this understanding open source is super like supportive for digital sovereignty, kind of intuitively. And this is a dangerous path because it's not that easy to explain. Like, why does it do that? So I took the time to break it down a little bit, and I hope this is informative. Let's see. So there's an organization called the Center for Digital Sovereignty in Germany, which is not that old, 3 years old now. And first of all, it's amazing that this exists. So a government has stepped up and understood that this is an important part of how they run the government and the country, and built the Center for Digital Sovereignty. And they're doing amazing work. For example, they're hosting Open Code, which is a like collaboration platform based on GitLab for public sector developments. And that's now seeing contributions from various countries. So for the first time, we're seeing basically international collaboration at the public level, not just industry level, on open source technologies. And to my surprise, it's actually also at different levels of the government. Like municipalities can cooperate with people working for a federal government, which is normally very difficult, diplomatic complexity, etc. So the definition that the Center for Digital Sovereignty applies is digital sovereignty describes the abilities and opportunities of individuals and institutions to be able to perform their roles in the digital world independently, self-determinedly, and securely. Two, stakeholder perspectives, individuals and institutions. With institutions, they primarily mean public institutions. And then 3 dimensions: independence, self-determination, and security. And they actually break this down pretty much like this. I put it on a slide, but that's still from their website that I've linked. It's about choice, adaptability, and influence. Choice meaning being able to choose the most suitable solution, and for a specific problem, not only having one and depending on that vendor, basically. Adaptability means the ability to co-shape that solution, to influence what it can do and how it works. And influence, as the third topic, is more on the projects and products themselves, on the governance, including, for example, what do the contracts look like, or the license models. So basically, if these things represent, these aspects represent what digital sovereignty is. And they're related to 2 other topics. And yesterday's event was called the European Resilience Summit. It wasn't called the Digital Sovereignty Summit. And we had a lot of discussions about this. And I actually like the focus on resilience. Because digital sovereignty, if, as you've seen on screen, is more like a status. It is, do you have it? Is a country sovereign? And is it also sovereign from a digital perspective? It's not dynamic. Resilience describes a bit more how you're able to, willing and able to deal with amorphous and unexpected challenges to that status. And we're seeing these challenges all the time. You can imagine it as like imagine a pot of water, that's your status. And the challenges are, it is warm and windy and it starts to evaporate, and you want to maintain the pot of water. That's sustainability, the sovereignty versus resilience. It freezes and you want to keep it liquid, so you have to react. The ability to react is resilience. And resilience over time is quite an effort, especially because we don't always know what the challenges are that are coming. Yesterday, of course, and that's why the debate was less about open source technologies and more about politics, trade, international relations, and everything else. We know that our sovereignty is threatened by various aspects. This includes economic viability or growth, simply, welfare. It includes international stability, it includes trade, the finance system, naturally, and politics. So I really think these aspects belong together. They don't mean the same. And I always interpret resilience as the actions that we take to maintain digital sovereignty. And I hope this makes sense to you. Now, open source is seen as a pillar for digital sovereignty or digital autonomy. Those 2 words are, by the way, used. Autonomy and sovereignty are kind of used interchangeably, which is also probably not correct. So there was a State of Digital Sovereignty report by Wire, which basically says open source was widely recognized as foundational to sovereignty. And you may know that we have our research arm, LF Research, that publishes basically open source market research about the community on a regular basis. Great group, they do excellent work. And one report that LF Research puts out on an annual basis is the World of Open Source Europe Spotlight. There's a World of Open Source report and there's a Europe Spotlight. And that one insight from the people that corresponded to our survey there was that open source is critical to digital sovereignty, providing greater control and agency over European technology stacks. So this is seen as an important aspect. And it translates to specific initiatives that are initiated by the European community. IPSI-CIS on the top right is a member state level investment scheme into cloud and infrastructure software. That also produces very interesting open source outcomes that we are hosting partially in the Neo-Nefros Foundation at Linux Foundation Europe. So public investments here lead to very specifically to outcomes as open source software, which is amazing. There is a ongoing tender. This is the one in the center for procuring cloud services that are digitally sovereign with a new set of criteria that basically don't just look at the price, but also look at how much do we make ourselves dependent on that. And there are many other initiatives here that you see quoted. The European Digital Infrastructure Consortium was just launched and is looking for an executive director here in Paris. And that's a joint collaboration, a joint initiative between France, the Netherlands, and Germany at the moment, and more countries are invited. But it's not just in the EU. So you're seeing the same theme represented all over the world. Even the Trump administration calls for more open source because we're in an international competition for innovativeness. And we realized, especially when you look at the recent waves of innovation in AI, that the only thing that you can't beat is open source innovation. It attracts the best experts globally. And it's very hard to compete with a group of the global best experts putting out their work for free. This combination is very hard to beat. So this is an international concern. And people choose sometimes more competitive ways and sometimes more collaborative ways to address it. And I think the European Union approach within the European Union is more collaborative. And I think with regards to open source development, that's a good thing. Now, that was all basically setting the scene. What is this problem of digital sovereignty? How do we maintain it? Resilience? How relevant is it? I'd like to contrast this a little bit with how we run projects. So our goal as Linux Foundation is to create the greatest shared technology investment in history. Frankly, we've already achieved that, which is amazing. And we want to keep it this way. We want to continue to grow it. So, as you know, all our projects are based on a couple of essential pillars of how they run: open source licensing, open governance, and that maps very specifically to those requirements for sovereignty and resilience that we've seen before. And I will talk about this a bit more later. Linux Foundation Europe is the European chapter. We are headquartered in Brussels. We are still part of the Linux Foundation ecosystem, of course, but we host projects within Europe. So we have projects like the Neonefos Foundation and Open Wallet Foundation that have their headquarters in Brussels. This is important sometimes, especially when you get public stakeholders investing into these projects. They would like to see the results under a European address. Makes sense. Might just be a bit of a feeling good about it question, but it makes them feel better about it. So they're more willing to invest. Other projects that we host in Europe include Servo, the web engine, Silva, which is a cloud-native stack for telecommunications, and others. So we see ourselves as a gateway into the global Linux Foundation ecosystem, bringing European participants into projects, bringing projects into Europe and enhancing their activities, and making sure that European policymakers understand that the open source ecosystem is beneficial to Europe and support it. And I think we've had quite some impact, especially when it comes to Cyber Resilience Act, on shaping some details about it that were influencing how we will work. What our participants expect from our projects are these four things: neutrality. No single organization, no single company can take our code, our trademarks, or our community away from the projects. You may have heard about issues with projects that have like single vendor approaches that do license switches. And I know that you run the Flux Nova project now, so you're fully aware of the issues that can come out of that. This is something that can't happen if a project is hosted at the Linux Foundation. You know that. We have open governance, meaning the parties that jointly fund the project form the governing board. The parties that, the contributors that participate in the project from a technical perspective form the technical steering committee. And these are the two dimensions of the project that are typically set up. We have clarity on IP. Everything we host is under a recognized open source license, or the trademarks are with the foundation, etc. You've probably heard all of this before, and we support commercial and volunteer participation in our projects. And the whole purpose of that is to create a continuous and sustainable ecosystem that creates this flywheel of we make the projects work well and attractive. That attracts contributors, that yields more contributions, and then we release updated versions of the software. This builds the community, and this is the typical open source flywheel. It's a virtuous cycle, and basically our business is to set this up for the projects that we hold. So what do the projects seek from us? I already spoke about neutrality. I think governance is incredibly important. The name of the Linux Foundation basically is a guarantee that a project is openly accessible to anybody who's interested in participating. And that's a good thing. We provide a lot of resources. For example, as you know, we have an excellent events team, an excellent marketing team. We do community building, and we provide infrastructure for some of the projects, which helps the projects grow, raise funds, and build the expertise to be successful. This is all, I expect, not new for you, but it's important to iterate this because this is how we run the projects. And I think that governance, besides open source licensing, is the key aspect that makes open source contribute to digital sovereignty. It is not just the technology as such, it's how it's developed and how open and collaborative this process is. And as a result, we are building developer communities and combined with commercial ecosystems that, from our perspective, make these projects thrive, because commercial participants are able to assign resources to open source development that individual volunteers can rarely provide. We do value the contributions from individual contributors. They're often the ones that are challenging the incumbent approaches. Students come up with crazy ideas. Some of these crazy ideas are really, really good. And then they start a new project and we're like, oh, that's a good idea. And that may then grow into a commercial ecosystem or successful startup. So I don't want to downplay volunteer contributions, but we do realize that in terms of volume and impact, a company that assigns a development team to an open source project can do more than a volunteer on the weekend or a student in their spare time. We have our group of project maintainers, the people that are taking responsibility for the projects. They're kind of putting their company hat to the side, and they put the Linux Foundation hat on technically, because the projects are hosted with us. So if you're a maintainer on a project and you make decisions for the project, you're kind of acting more as a Linux Foundation person, for the project, than as a person for your company. In a crazy case, you may reject a pull request from your own colleague because it's not good enough. You say, hey, this needs to be better maintained and it decreases unit test coverage. So I'm not accepting this, even though I technically work in the same company, because you're representing the project in this minute and the developer represents the company. This is interesting sometimes. And of course, we have a whole network around this of support professionals, people working in the OSPOs, people sometimes working on corporate strategy, thinking, how does our open source participation fit into our corporate goals? And the best fit, of course, is they realize, yes, open source participation supports our corporate goals, and that's why we're investing, legal, etc. So, as I said, this is probably not new to you. We have 3 types of projects. Community projects, sometimes overlooked. The Linux Foundation hosts a lot of projects that do not have commercial participation, or do not have funding in that sense. Commercial participation they do have. For example, the SPX project, hugely impactful, but it works fine without funding. With others, Fossology, Chaos, Linux Boot, these are projects that are sometimes super critical. Linux Boot, for example, but they don't have a funding effort behind them, and we're just hosting them, and people are very happy about this. We have single technical projects that have funding, Node.js, OpenAPI, others. And then we have the big names are usually foundations that hold multiple technical projects. If you're hitting CNCF or FINOS, those are foundations that are kind of under the Linux Foundation. There's a whole hierarchy of more foundations and then technical projects. But all these projects implement the same pillars that I mentioned before: open governance, open source licensing, etc. And yeah, so open licensing, etc. But this was the slide for that. So basically, anybody who hears this is a project hosted at the Linux Foundation can expect these pillars to be in place. Open licensing, open governance, participation is open to anybody who's interested to contribute to the project according to the charter of the project. This is sometimes a political challenge for us because we are more open than sometimes the political processes are. We say, we don't really look at where you're coming from, as long as you're willing to work according to the project charter and the project license. And this doesn't always work because we live in an existing political and legal system. And that means, for example, if a country is under sanction, we can't invite somebody from that country to be a maintainer on our projects. Because as I just said, the maintainer represents the project and not the country or the employer, which is why we had to boot some of the Russian-affiliated Linux kernel maintainers from their role. But this is kind of the extent to which we make compromises on our pillars of openness, basically. So this is how the Linux Foundation works. And now we have this, so we had, what does digital sovereignty mean and resilience, and how do we work when we host our projects? And now we can try to bring these two things together. So if you revisit the three strategic dimensions, choice, adaptability, and influence, open source collaboration under these conditions that I've described support all three of them. So open source solutions, of course, extend the range of available options. So it's more choice. They're more adaptable, especially if you participate upstream as a stakeholder. You're absolutely able to ensure that the project is well maintained, the technical roadmap matches your requirements, and you can take an actual active influence on that. So that affords you with resilience if necessary, but it requires upstream participation. And influence, you can influence how the projects are governed. We make it very transparent and very explicit. If you participate in the governance of a project, if you're co-funded, these are the rules how you can make yourself heard in the governing board. And there is, in an extreme case, the right to fork, meaning to walk away with the project. You're never depending on how the governance of the project is currently set up to use the technology. You can always use the technology without engaging with the community. And if you really, really need the technology to work to be developed in a different way than the current governance of the project, then the right to fork is your safeguard. We try to work to avoid that situation. And I think we're doing it quite successfully. But it's a safeguard that is present in all open source collaboration. And I think that's a very important aspect. This results in a whole spectrum of collaboration from software. We talked a lot about software, but we have RISC-V, which is a hardware specification. We have industry standards. SPDX has been translated to an ISO standard to be more formalized. Some of these, this become industry standards first and then international standards, meaning recognized by a standards development organization. We have Overture Maps, which is mostly map data developed under the same principles. One aspect that is important, and I keep repeating this to our European stakeholders, and I know GAP does it too. Open source is a meritocracy. You gain influence by participating either in the governance of projects or in the development of projects. If you're just a consumer, it's really just this set of building blocks. It's not something you can actively influence. And to our, unhappiness, I would say, you don't find many European companies in the top 10, any actually. In the top 20, you find 3. SAP, SUSE, and JetBrains, that are the key contributors globally to open source. So only 3 companies in the top 20 are European-based. That doesn't mean, interestingly, that only 3 out of 20 contributions come from Europe. The CNCF publishes the developer statistics of their projects, and if you add up the European Union member states, it's actually pretty much a third. It's very equally distributed across the globe. But in terms of companies, we only have 3 out of the top 20. However, we do see our participants step up. I mentioned the FINOS Foundation a couple of times, and you see the members here are mostly European companies. SAP, Stackit is part of Schwarz IT, T-Systems. Similarly, the Silva project has Orange in it, Telefonica, TIM. LF Energy is a very interesting one, brings together energy operators, so energy network operators, and has a very strong footing in Europe with companies like Shell or Alliander or many others. So we're seeing progress. We're seeing people step up. But we have to say, those are companies that understand both the corporate value of open source collaboration, but also of the necessity of a strategic approach and to make it work towards your own corporate goals. Being a passive consumer is not the best way. And other regions have recognized this a little bit earlier than Europe. China has recognized, maybe with an external nudge of being forced off Android, that dependence on big players is a risk to digital sovereignty in your country, and has implemented a strategy to basically replace key technologies that they're depending on with open source technologies. And this has been going on for much longer than we think, more than 20 years now. China was the first to deploy desktop Linux with a fork of the KDE project that is my home community, where I come from, already before the 2000s, in their educational institutions, etc. And in the United States, it's more driven by big tech companies, but I don't know if you find any big tech company today that is not actively building on top of open source software and also contributing massively back to it. So if you look at the three major economic regions in the world, China and the US are, I would say, ahead in the strategic adoption of open source. I also showed this to our European policymakers, and they don't like the message very much. And I would like to conclude with, what is the main impact that really supports achieving digital sovereignty by adopting open source? And it's what we've been saying for a long time. Open source defines what your market is. It pushes costs down, and it pushes newly developed technologies very quickly through a cycle from innovation to commodity. We have a cycle of 1 to 1.5 years where something new that comes up in open source is now standard. A typical project is widely used, everybody contributes to it. So it went from the hot thing today to total commodity, and you can download as a package in 3 seconds in 18 months. That's what open source does. And it shapes markets by that, because it says, that's not what we want to compete about. I don't want you to develop 15 packages that do the same thing. I want us to go up in the value stack and say, I want financial solutions to be developed on top of that. I want energy solutions to be developed on top of that. And that's what open source does. And because these foundational technologies are then all available under these principles that I have described, they support digital sovereignty, and they support the resilience bits because they allow you to react. So thank you. That was my message for today.
The question is, what did you were at the conference yesterday? What was the main misunderstanding of, well, where is it posted?
It was not a misunderstanding, really. It is that it's probably a myopic perspective of us, because we're thinking we are part of the open source community, we're hosting open source projects. So clearly open source is the most important thing, like the math teacher in school saying, the only thing that you need to learn about is math. Everything follows from it. And there were other stakeholders there that were not technologists. They were people coming from the foreign services. So they look for diplomats, that look at international relations. For them, technology is something that exists, but it's not like, it doesn't drive the things. And this was a surprising insight for me, is that we have to explain more that actually technology is driving many of the changes that we're seeing. Digitalization is probably the most important driver of innovation in the last 20 years, because it affects everything from, how we consume movies to how we perform financial transactions. And I think this was the most important takeaway. These people are not ignorant, and we are not ignorant. We're just coming from different worlds, and we believe that open source is much more central to everything that everybody else thinks.
Realize that was open source. The US part.
Yeah, very good.
I enjoyed this digital sovereignty. I heard the word sovereignty, it seems so attached to national, but it's your definition is much more useful. This national interest sovereign definition, like we have for the cloud.
So I'm not sure if this, we're not sure if we're sharing slides, but if this is actually a link to the Center for Digital Sovereignty website, and this is really taken from that public agency that works towards digital sovereignty. So yes, the discussion is exactly sometimes more nationalistic sometimes, or more restrictive, like we want our own stuff and we don't want other people to touch our stuff. And that's not open source at all, right? But it's important to see that even the public actors here are using that very open definition. They're not thinking of restricting. There was another question back there. So yeah. There is a, oh yeah, so the question is what do governments have to change with regards to procurement to make this happen? First of all, the European Union is reopening and rewriting the procurement directive. And there is an ongoing consultation process on that, with a deadline in January where we are responding. So this is an important subject that's currently being discussed. I think this is more a matter of expertise and understanding how software is developed today than of changing procurement requirements. I know there are different perspectives on this. One aspect is, do non-monetary questions like how maintained, how healthy is this software become part of procurement rules? This is something that is being looked at by the European Commission. But another aspect is, you can actually write requirements like, I would like you to deploy this solution for me, and any change you make, I would like you to contribute those upstream, and they need to be integrated in the next major version of the software. It would be absolutely possible today to write this into a procurement tender, but we don't, because it's a matter of expertise. We need to understand that the market works this way, and then the public can use the very strong arm in Europe, especially, of public procurement to force upstream maintenance. Because you can say, if all of this needs to be upstream committed, then I'm contributing to maintenance by procuring the solution this way. The public share of GDP spent by the public in Europe and the European Union on average is 49.6%. 49.6% of all Europe's GDP, very good, very close, is spent by the public, which kind of tells us what a strong tool public procurement is. So we are trying to contribute to this review of the procurement directive, and I really think this so far is a lost opportunity because the public can use that arm much more to support open source. Employment then? Yeah, this is actually an interesting one. When we say the public needs more expertise and it needs to ask more for operating a service that it owns, as opposed to delivering a ready-made solution that might be proprietary, then you are shifting some necessary expertise from the supplier to government. Because how do you write that tender? You need somebody who knows about it. You also need somebody who's able to say, this works for me. So you need to move some expertise in-house. So the governments need to understand that some of this needs to be public sector expertise. And this is why we're saying the best way to acquire this expertise is to work upstream. And this is the main argument that we're giving governments to say, let your people work on open source projects, because it teaches them how the projects work and they will understand where the projects are headed and if that's good for you or not. So yes, there's going to be a required shift of expertise and capacity back from the suppliers to the government. Not sure if governments agree on this already.
So source.
Yeah, that usually sorts itself out because new people come in that do know it. We've seen massive improvements there. Open source is not a new thing now. Like, I learned it when I was a student, and that is clearly a long time ago. Yes, 30 years. I graduated in 98, almost. So I would say today, taught cohorts of students that are now in industry in influential positions on open source. I would expect that by now industry has figured it out. Not always. It's the only way to cope with all of this is to be an eternal optimist. So I made it a habit. I think I'm running way over time here, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mirko. It was very insightful.